20 years ago, if a state gave a taxpayer dollar to a Catholic school, that was, well, it was a constitutional crisis.
Oh, absolutely. A massive one.
Right. But today, if a state refuses to give that same taxpayer dollar to a Catholic school, that is a constitutional crisis. The Supreme Court didn't just, move the walls separating church and state. They completely demolished it.
Brick by brick.
Exactly. And they rebuilt it with a fundamentally different architecture. So here is how it happened.
Yeah, it's arguably the most profound structural inversion in modern constitutional law. I mean, for most of the 20th century, the core legal question under the Establishment Clause was simple. It was how much public aid, if any, can flow to religious schools before that wall of separation is breached.
Right. The goal was keeping the money away.
Exactly. The entire legal apparatus was designed to keep the state far, far away from religion. But today, as you noted, the question has completely flipped. The standard shifted from a strict rule of no aid to religion to this modern mandate of, well, no exclusion of religion.
To trace this doctrinal turning point, we have a really fascinating stack of sources in front of us today for this deep dive.
We really do. We're looking directly at the pivotal Supreme Court decisions, obviously.
Right.
But also the historical briefs submitted to the court, scholarly analyses from law reviews, and advocacy materials from groups on both sides, like the Institute for Justice and EdChoice.
So our mission today is to map exactly how we got from point A to point B. We want to explore the sociological shifts, the legal strategies, and the really complex funding mechanisms that made this new reality possible.
And we are going to look closely at the friction between two clauses in the First Amendment that are just constantly pulling in opposite directions.
The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause.
You got it. The Establishment Clause prevents the government from supporting religion, and the Free Exercise Clause prevents the government from discriminating against it.
Now, before we dive any deeper, I want to set a really critical ground rule for today's deep dive. The material we are exploring is intensely politically charged. Yeah, it involves deeply held convictions, left-wing arguments, right-wing arguments, and fundamentally opposing visions of what American society should even look like. So we are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoint or policy outcome. Our goal for you, the listener, is strictly to impart the factual content, the historical context, and the legal arguments found in our source material.
We just want to give you the tools to understand the landscape of modern school choice law.
Right, so you can see the whole board, regardless of where you personally stand on the issue. Okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to understand how the wall came down, we first need to look at the mortar that held it together for 50 years, right?
Yeah, we need the baseline.
So what was the baseline for the modern era?
The baseline was the Lemon Framework. This stems from a 1971 Supreme Court case called Lemon v. Kurtzman.
Okay.
For decades, if a legislature wanted to interact with private education in literally any way, they had to survive the Lemon test.
And that's a three-pronged test, right?
Exactly. It was a three-pronged test designed to ensure public money never, ever funded religious instruction. First, the government action had to have a secular legislative purpose.
Makes sense.
Second, its primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion.
Okay, so neutral effect.
Right. And third, it must not foster an excessive government entanglement with religion.
So secular purpose, neutral effect, and no excessive entanglement. But looking at the source material and tracking how this played out in the lower courts throughout the 70s and 80s, it seems like that third prong, the entanglement one, was a massive trap for lawmakers.
Oh, it absolutely was a trap. It created this almost impossible paradox. The entanglement prong became the ultimate catch-22 in constitutional law.
Walk us through how that actually looked.
Well, imagine a state wants to pay for a secular math teacher to teach remedial math inside a parochial school, just standard math.
Okay, pretty straightforward.
Right. But to satisfy the first two prongs of the Lemon test, the state has to guarantee that the math teacher isn't secretly slipping Bible verses into the algebra lesson. The public money can only fund secular education.
Right, which means the state has to monitor the teacher.
Exactly. But the act of monitoring the teacher, like putting a state administrator in the back of a parochial classroom or reviewing the religious school's curriculum line by line, that constitutes excessive government entanglement.
Oh, wow. So to guarantee you aren't advancing religion, you have to surveil the church.
Yes.
But surveilling the church violates the third prong.
You're trapped. You just can't win.
It's the legal equivalent of a surveillance camera analogy. Like, the only way to prove the camera isn't filming something illegal is to constantly watch the footage, but the act of watching the footage is itself an invasion of privacy.
That's a great way to put it.
I remember looking at cases from the 1980s, like Aguilar v. Felton, where this got so absurd that public school teachers were literally teaching remedial reading to parochial students inside vans.
Oh, yeah, the vans.
Just vans parked on the public street outside the Catholic school, just to avoid triggering the entanglement prong by walking into the building.
It is the perfect historical example of how weird this got. The Lemon test resulted in what many scholars called a jurisprudence of bizarre distinctions.
Bizarre distinctions? What do you mean?
Well, a state could use taxpayer money to buy secular textbooks for religious schools, but it couldn't buy them maps or science speakers.
Wait, really? A textbook is fine, but a map is unconstitutional.
Yep. Because a book can be reviewed once for secular content, whereas a map or a beaker might be used by a creative teacher for a religious lesson later on.
That is wild.
The default suspicion ran completely against any aid. Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation was interpreted as a strict, almost impermeable barrier.
But there was a flaw, right? Or rather, a seed planted way back in the 1940s that would eventually crack that wall. The Everson child benefit theory.
Ah, yes. We have to rewind a bit to 1947, to Everson v. Board of Education.
Right, so in that case, a local government in New Jersey was reimbursing parents for the cost of putting their kids on public buses to get to school.
And that included Catholic parochial schools.
Exactly. So how did the court handle that?
The Everson decision is really fascinating because it is actually the case that formally applied the Establishment Clause to the states. And it uses incredibly strict separationist language.
But they allowed the bus money.
They did. It ruled in favor of the bus reimbursements. The court reasoned that the state wasn't funding a church. It was funding public safety.
Okay, so it's a safety measure.
Right. It was ensuring children didn't get hit by cars while walking along the highway.
I get it. The aid flows to the individual beneficiary, the child, not the religious institution. The child just happens to be taking that state-provided safety benefit to a religious destination.
Exactly. The child benefit theory.
But for 50 years, advocates for religious schools wondered if that logic could stretch. Like, could it go beyond peripheral things like bus rides and textbooks? Could the child benefit theory stretch to cover actual tuition?
And it took a catastrophic failure in public schooling to give them the test case they needed to find out.
Right, the crisis in Ohio.
Yeah, this took place in Cleveland, Ohio in the mid-1990s. The public school system there was experiencing a complete catastrophic failure.
How bad was it?
Bad enough that a federal judge eventually ordered the state to take over the district. You had staggering dropout rates, schools failing to meet basic state standards, and lower-income families feeling entirely trapped.
Trapped in a system that couldn't even guarantee their children's safety, let alone their education.
Exactly. So in response to this emergency, Ohio passes the Cleveland Scholarship and Tutoring Program in 1995. They decide to offer vouchers to low-income families.
Okay, let's pause here. For any of you listening who are new to the mechanics of school choice law, let's establish exactly how a voucher operates fundamentally. Let's compare it to the other models later. Just a voucher for now.
Sure. A voucher is a direct funding mechanism. The state treasury issues a certificate with a specific monetary value.
And in Cleveland's original program, that was up to about $2,250, right?
Right. So the state gives the certificate directly to a qualifying family. The family then takes that voucher and spends it on tuition at a participating private school. It acts as a targeted, single-use educational grant funded by taxpayers.
Okay, so the state gives the family the voucher, and the family goes shopping for a better school.
Yes.
But here is where the legal collision happens. In 1995, in Cleveland, if you were shopping for a private school with a voucher worth $2,250, your options were, well, almost entirely religious schools.
Over 96% of the students who participated in the Cleveland voucher program ended up using those state funds at religious schools.
96%. And the vast majority of those were Catholic.
Yeah. So opponents of the program immediately filed suit. They looked at the reality on the ground and argued that the state of Ohio was effectively bankrolling the Catholic school system.
They argued this was a blatant violation of the Establishment Clause.
Exactly. They felt it was effectively forcing taxpayers to fund religious indoctrination.
Which brings us to the real hinge point of our entire timeline today. Zelman v. Simmons-Harris, decided on June 27, 2002.
This is a bitterly divided 5-4 Supreme Court decision that completely changes the trajectory of constitutional law.
So Chief Justice William Rehnquist authored the majority opinion, and his logic is the direct culmination of that Everson child benefit seed we talked about.
It really is. Rehnquist looked at the Cleveland program and declared it was a program of true private choice. He argued the program was entirely neutral with respect to religion.
Let's challenge that neutrality argument for a second, because the dissent certainly did. I mean, how can a program be considered neutral when 96% of the taxpayer money is going straight into the collection plate of parochial schools?
Well, Rehnquist's argument rested entirely on the mechanism of delivery. He stated that the government wasn't writing checks to the Catholic Church, the government was writing checks to low-income parents.
So the parent is the middleman.
He called the parent a constitutional circuit breaker. The state says, here is a neutral benefit, go where you wish. If the parent overwhelmingly chooses a religious school, that is a product of private, independent decision-making, not government preference. The state's hand remains clean.
But Justice David Souter, who is joined by Stevens, Ginsburg, and Breyer, wrote a furious dissent against this.
Furious is the right word.
Reading Souter's opinion, he essentially accuses the majority of allowing the state to launder money through the parents. Souter argued that the true private choice formula is an illusion.
Right, because of the market options.
Exactly. If the state sets up a market where the only mortable options are religious schools and then hands parents a voucher, the state knows exactly where that money is going. Souter viewed this as outsourcing the establishment of religion to the parents, fundamentally devaluing the Establishment Clause.
Souter's point was that the wall of separation shouldn't depend on the mechanical routing of the check. If the end result is that millions of taxpayer dollars are paying for religious education, the Constitution is violated, regardless of the intermediary.
But Souter was in the minority.
He was. The 5-4 majority held. Zelman established that the state could legally fund religious schooling, provided the funding mechanism relied on the private choice of parents.
Okay, so Zelman proved that the state could fund religious schools. But when did the doctrine shift from the state may fund them to the state must not exclude them? Because that is a massive philosophical leap.
It is the defining leap of the modern era, and what is most striking is the velocity of the change.
How fast are we talking?
We are talking about a trilogy of Supreme Court cases decided over just 5 years, from 2017 to 2022. They completely rewired the constitutional center of gravity away from the Establishment Clause and directly toward the Free Exercise Clause.
Let's examine this free exercise trilogy, starting with a case that, honestly, seems incredibly mundane on its surface.
Trinity Lutheran Church v. Comer in 2017.
Right. Here we're moving from school vouchers in Cleveland to, of all things, playground rubber in Missouri.
It sounds so mundane, but it's crucial. Missouri operated a state environmental program that offered competitive grants to nonprofits to help them resurface their playgrounds using recycled tire rubber.
Okay.
It is a pure safety measure to provide soft surfaces for kids to play on. Trinity Lutheran Church operated a preschool, and they applied for this grant. Their application was excellent. They ranked 5th out of 44 applicants based on the state's own neutral criteria.
But the state of Missouri categorically denied them the grant. And looking at the case files, Missouri didn't deny them because their playground wasn't worthy. They denied them specifically because of their state constitution.
That is the crux of the case. Missouri, like many states, had a strict provision in its state constitution, often referred to as a Blaine Amendment, which we are going to explore deeply in a moment, that strictly forbade any public money from going to a church or sectarian institution.
So they hit a legal wall.
The state officials looked at the Constitution and said, well, we have no choice. You are a church, therefore you are disqualified from receiving these state funds.
The Supreme Court looked at this and essentially argued that recycled tires are entirely secular, right? I mean, there's no inherent theology in playground safety.
Not at all.
Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the 7-2 majority opinion, ruling that Missouri's action was unconstitutional. He argued that denying a church an otherwise available public benefit solely on account of its religious status is blatant discrimination.
Right. He said it penalizes them for the free exercise of their religion.
But the court tried to put a speed limit on this logic, didn't they? I mean, they realized how broad this could get.
They did, in what became a very famous piece of legal text known as Footnote 3. In the Trinity Lutheran opinion, Chief Justice Roberts explicitly wrote that this decision was limited only to express discrimination based on religious identity with respect to playground resurfacing.
Wow, very specific.
They were desperately trying to draw a line in the sand between religious status and religious use.
So if I have this right, under footnote 3, being a church, your status cannot disqualify you from getting secular tire rubber. But if you wanted state money to buy Bibles or fund a theology class, which is religious use, that might still be forbidden under the Establishment Clause.
That was the intended boundary. But as Justice Neil Gorsuch pointed out in his concurrence at the time, that line is incredibly unstable.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. Does a church use its playground for religious purposes? What if they hold an outdoor Sunday school class on the new rubber surface?
Oh, I see.
In constitutional law, boundaries based on such fine distinctions are notoriously hard to hold.
Which brings the collapse of that boundary into sharp focus in the second case of the trilogy, Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue in 2020.
Right. Montana had created a program to help families pay for private school, but unlike Cleveland, it wasn't a direct voucher. It was a tax credit scholarship program.
Okay, we'll get into the mechanics of that in a second, but what happened?
The Montana Department of Revenue looked at their own state constitution's No Aid to Religion clause, and they preemptively barred families from using these new state-supported scholarships at religious schools. They wanted to avoid an Establishment Clause violation.
So Montana's looking at the landscape post-Zelman and actively trying to block the religious schools from participating just to maintain their state-level wall of separation.
Yeah, exactly. But Chief Justice Roberts, this time writing for a much tighter 5-4 majority, struck down Montana's rule. He extended the logic of Trinity Lutheran from playground rubber straight to educational funding.
So the speed limit is gone.
Roberts ruled that while a state doesn't have to subsidize private education, once it decides to create a subsidy program, it cannot disqualify certain schools solely because of their religious status.
But wait, what happened to footnote 3? What about the difference between status and use? A school isn't just a building. It's an institution whose primary purpose is instruction. And if it's a religious school, part of that instruction is religious use.
That distinction completely imploded in the third case of the trilogy, Carson v. Makin in 2022. To understand this case, you have to understand the unique geography of Maine.
Right. Maine has areas so rural and sparsely populated that many towns literally do not even operate their own public high schools. It's just not economically feasible for them.
Because of that, Maine had a long-standing program where the state would pay tuition for students in those rural districts to attend private schools, either inside Maine or even in other states. It was a way of guaranteeing their right to an education.
That makes sense.
However, Maine had a strict rule. The state tuition assistance could only be used at non-sectarian schools.
Meaning secular. No religious schools allowed.
Correct. When parents sued, Maine's Attorney General presented a very clever defense based exactly on the boundary the Supreme Court had tried to draw in Trinity Lutheran.
They brought back the status versus use argument.
Yes. Maine argued, look, we aren't discriminating based on religious status. We aren't excluding these schools just because they are affiliated with a church. We are excluding them because of their religious use.
Right, because they teach religion.
Exactly. These schools proudly state that they weave their faith into every subject they teach. The state funds would actively be used for religious instruction, and the Establishment Clause forbids us from funding that.
It's the ultimate test of footnote 3. Maine is saying, we will fund your math class, but we won't fund your chapel service, and since your school combines both, we can't fund the school.
But the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision authored again by Roberts, rejected Maine's argument entirely. The court struck down the nonsectarian requirement, officially erasing the line between status and use.
How did Roberts justify that?
Roberts argued that you cannot separate what a religious school is from what a religious school does. Educating children in their faith is the very core of their religious exercise. Therefore, refusing to fund a school because it will use the money for religious instruction is inherently discrimination against religious exercise.
If you step back and look at the timeline, the velocity of this is just breathtaking.
It really is.
I mean, in 2017, the court is saying you can't deny them tire rubber, but this is only about playgrounds. By 2020, they say you can't deny them tax credit scholarships just because they are a religious school. And by 2022, they are saying if you offer tuition assistance to secular private schools, You must not deny that same assistance to a religious school, specifically because it will use the money for religious instruction in the classroom.
It went from secular tire rubber to funded Sunday school lessons in exactly 5 years.
It is a total doctrinal revolution. And to truly grasp the impact of this revolution, we can't just look at the Supreme Court opinions, right?
Yeah.
We have to follow the money.
Always follow the money.
We have to look at how state legislatures, emboldened by these rulings, rapidly evolved the actual mechanisms to fund these choices on the ground.
Let's dive deep into that policy machinery, because it's complex. We mentioned vouchers earlier with Cleveland, but the school choice movement didn't stop at vouchers. They developed much more sophisticated financial instruments.
So let's compare and contrast the primary mechanisms. We've got vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and the current gold standard, education savings accounts, or ESAs. Let's start with a recap of the voucher.
Okay, a traditional voucher, the Zelman model, is the most straightforward. The state treasury appropriates funds, cuts a check or a certificate, hands it to the parent, and the parent signs it over to the private school.
So it is a direct, linear flow of state money, even if the parent is holding the compass.
Right. Now, contrast that with the Espinoza model, the tax credit scholarship. This mechanism was engineered specifically to survive in a more hostile legal environment.
The environment before the wall came down.
Exactly. In this model, individuals or corporations donate their private money to a nonprofit organization known as a scholarship granting organization.
Okay.
In exchange for that donation, the state rewards the donor with a tax credit, often a 100% dollar-for-dollar credit against their state tax liability. The nonprofit then takes that pool of donated money and distributes it to families as private school scholarships.
It's an ingenious legal buffer zone.
Huh.
Because the money never actually enters the state treasury and it passes through private donors to a private nonprofit, proponents could argue it isn't public money at all.
That was the brilliance of it.
It historically possessed an extra layer of constitutional insulation. It was a way for states to incentivize the funding of private religious education without technically appropriating a single dollar from the general fund to a church.
It was a brilliant workaround designed for the era of the Lemon Test. But as the Supreme Court systematically dismantled those Establishment Clause barriers, states realized they didn't necessarily need the buffer zone anymore. They could be much more direct and much more expansive.
Which brings us to the ultimate evolution in the funding machinery, the Education Savings Account, or ESA.
Right.
If you're listening to this and thinking, wait, doesn't my state have a voucher program? You might actually be looking at an ESA. So how does an ESA fundamentally differ from a voucher?
A voucher is a single-use gift card. It can only be spent on one thing, which is tuition at a participating private school. An ESA unbundles education entirely.
Unbundles it. How so?
With an ESA, the state takes a portion of the per-pupil funding that would have gone to the public school district to educate that child and deposits it directly into a restricted, flexible spending account controlled by the family.
Oh, wow. So the family becomes the general contractor of their child's education.
Precisely. They can use a portion of that ESA money for private school tuition, but they don't have to. They can spend it on private tutors, specialized behavioral therapies, textbooks, homeschooling curriculums, educational software, or even community college courses.
According to data from EdChoice in our source stack, families are using these accounts to hyper-customize education in ways a single institution never could.
It is a profound philosophical shift. You move from funding a system of public institutions to funding individual students directly in an open marketplace. And the scale of this has exploded.
Because for years, these programs were small, right? They were capped by income, so only families in poverty qualified, or they were restricted to students with severe special needs.
But the Supreme Court's rulings removed the legal anxieties holding legislatures back. 2022 marked the watershed moment. Arizona passed legislation removing all income caps and all special needs requirements. They made its ESA program universally available to every single student in the state.
The impact of universalizing the program is just staggering. The floodgates opened. According to our sources, participation in Arizona's ESA program reportedly jumped from roughly 12,000 students to nearly 90,000 students within just a few years.
That is a massive spike.
The state spending on the program, which was originally projected in the tens of millions, skyrocketed into the hundreds of millions of dollars. It created massive budgetary debates within the state legislature about the sustainability of funding two separate education systems simultaneously.
And Arizona was merely the vanguard. Advocacy groups explicitly dubbed 2023 the year of universal choice. Following Arizona's blueprint, States across the country, Arkansas, Iowa, Utah, Florida, and others, adopted universal or near universal ESA programs.
The doctrinal permission slip granted by Carson v. Makin triggered an absolute policy revolution at the state level.
It did, but this raises a massive historical question.
Right.
If the Supreme Court gave the green light, what about the state constitutions? We mentioned earlier that Missouri and Montana had strict state-level bans on funding religious schools. In fact, over 30 states had these provisions in their state constitutions.
So how did the school choice movement bypass the fundamental law of the states themselves?
To dismantle those state constitutional barriers, advocates couldn't just argue abstract legal theory. They had to put history on trial. This is the story of the Blaine Amendments, and it is one of the most masterful and controversial legal strategies of the modern era.
So how did a failed 1875 federal law become the ultimate weapon for 21st century religious schools?
We have to go back to 1875. Congressman James G. Blaine, who had presidential ambitions, proposed an amendment to the federal Constitution. His amendment would have explicitly barred any public funds from aiding sectarian schools.
Did it pass?
The amendment passed the House overwhelmingly but narrowly failed in the Senate.
But the idea survived, and it metastasized into the states. Over the next several decades, state after state adopted their own versions of Blaine's ban into their state constitutions.
And for most of the 20th century, if you asked a legal scholar about state Blaine amendments, they would tell you these were just neutral, good governance laws. They were viewed as local safeguards maintaining a strict separation of church and state.
That was the accepted narrative. But legal advocacy groups, most notably the Institute for Justice, decided to dig into the actual historical origins of the 1870s. And what they unearthed was a history steeped in virulent nativism and religious bigotry.
The 19th century context is crucial here. In the mid-1800s, America experienced a massive wave of Catholic immigration, primarily from Ireland and Germany.
Right.
The established Protestant majority viewed this demographic shift not just as a cultural change, but as a fundamental threat to the American Republic.
Yeah.
They viewed Catholicism as a foreign authoritarian influence.
And the primary battleground for this cultural anxiety was the nascent public school system.
Yes.
The early public schools, known as common schools, they were not secular in the modern sense at all. They were heavily, explicitly Protestant in their character. They mandated the daily reading of the Protestant King James Bible, they sang Protestant hymns, and they used textbooks that frequently depicted the Pope as the Antichrist and Catholicism as a corrupted faith.
Naturally, Catholic immigrants objected to their children being subjected to this environment. The tension boiled over into actual violence, like the Philadelphia Bible riots of 1844, where churches were burned to the ground over the issue of which Bible would be read in public schools.
It was incredibly volatile.
Because the common schools were overtly hostile, Catholics began building their own parallel parochial school system, and they asked local governments for a share of the public education funds to support it.
And the Protestant majority reacted by passing the Blaine Amendments to permanently shut that request down.
Exactly. The historical record shows that the word sectarian in these 19th century amendments wasn't a neutral synonym for religious. It was a widely understood code word for Catholic.
Protestantism was viewed as the baseline, non-sectarian American culture, while Catholicism was the dangerous sectarian threat.
Right. The specific intent of these amendments was to starve immigrant Catholic parochial schools of public funding while protecting state funding for the Protestant-inflected common schools.
The brilliance of the legal strategy employed by the Institute for Justice was taking this 19th century bigotry and weaponizing it against 21st century separation laws. They walked into the Supreme Court and said, look at these state constitutions. Look at Missouri. Look at Montana. These laws are not noble, neutral safeguards of the Establishment Clause. They are instruments of bigotry.
They were born of anti-Catholic prejudice.
And their very existence today is a continuation of that discriminatory intent.
The framing was incredibly effective. When you read the concurrences in cases like Espinoza, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito spend pages amplifying this specific nativist history. By successfully recasting the Blaine Amendments from neutral principles of constitutional separation into toxic relics of know-nothing bigotry, choice advocates made them legally radioactive.
It became almost impossible for a state attorney general to defend their own state constitution without looking like an apologist for 19th century prejudice.
But it is vital to note that this framing is heavily contested by historians.
Really, what do the critics say?
Critics of the court's narrative argue that this flattens a vastly more complex history. They point out that while the anti-Catholic nativism was undeniably real and abhorrent, the coalition that supported Blaine Amendments also included people who genuinely believed in the strict separation of church and state as a vital principle of liberal democracy, completely apart from any animus.
So it wasn't purely just bigotry.
Furthermore, critics argue that a law can have an ugly origin but still serve a defensible, neutral purpose a century later. They argue the court weaponized a partial history to achieve a predetermined policy outcome.
Regardless of the historical debate in the courtroom, the Institute for Justice's narrative won a decisive victory. It provided the Supreme Court with the moral and historical justification necessary to essentially neutralize state-level Blaine Amendments across the country,
clearing the path for the universal ESA programs we see today.
So by 2022, the state-level Blaine Amendments are effectively defanged. The funding mechanisms, ES, and tax credits are legally secure. But one ghost still haunted the jurisprudence: the lemon test.
The old trap.
Even though the court had been ignoring it or working around it for years, it was still technically on the books, lurking in the background.
To see how the lemon test finally met its end, we have to look at the capstone case of this era, Kennedy v. Bremerton School District in 2022. And interestingly, this case has nothing to do with school funding. It is about a high school football coach.
Joseph Kennedy was an assistant football coach at a public high school in Washington State. His practice was to go to the 50-yard line immediately after games, take a knee, and pray quietly. But over time, the practice grew. Players from his team and eventually players from the opposing teams started joining him on the field.
The school district watched this escalating situation and panicked. They saw an authority figure employed by the state wearing a school uniform on public school property at the center of a school-sponsored event, leading a religious observance.
They looked directly at the lemon test.
They feared that if they allowed this to continue, they would be violating the Establishment Clause by endorsing religion or creating the primary effect of advancing it. So they asked Coach Kennedy to stop the public, on-field prayers, or at least move them to a private location like the locker room.
But he refused.
He argued it violated his religious beliefs, and the district ultimately put him on administrative leave.
The case goes to the Supreme Court, and in a 6-3 decision authored by Justice Neil Gorsuch, the court rules in favor of the coach. Gorsuch argued that Kennedy's prayer was a private, personal, religious observance protected by both the free speech and free exercise clauses, not a government-sponsored event.
But the truly seismic impact of Kennedy v. Bremerton wasn't about the specific facts of the football field. It was what Justice Gorsuch did to the lemon test itself.
What did he do?
In the majority opinion, Gorsuch formally declared that the lemon test, along with its related endorsement test, had been long ago abandoned by the court.
Just like that.
He dismissed the decades-old precedent as abstract and ahistorical.
He didn't even formally overrule it in the traditional sense. He basically wrote its obituary, claiming the court had already stopped using it and lower courts just needed to catch up. So if the three prongs of lemon secular purpose, neutral effect, excessive entanglement are dead, what is the new rule for the Establishment Clause?
Gorsuch instructed lower courts that from now on, the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by reference to historical practices and understandings. The new standard is history and tradition.
History and tradition.
Instead of a mechanical, functional test analyzing the effects of a law, judges now have to conduct a historical inquiry. They have to look back at the founding era and ask, is this the kind of thing the founders would have considered an establishment of religion back in 1791?
The shift from a functional test to a historical test completely changes how courts evaluate these cases. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in a blistering dissent joined by Breyer and Kagan, sounded a massive alarm about what this means for religious minorities and dissenting students.
Sotomayor first accused the majority of misrepresenting the facts of the case, arguing that a head coach praying at the 50-yard line surrounded by players and media is the exact opposite of a private moment. But her deeper legal critique focused on the danger of abandoning lemon.
Right. Sotomayor warned that replacing a workable legal test with a vague, malleable appeal to history and tradition deeply erodes protections against coercion.
She painted a vivid picture of the reality on the ground.
If you are a 16-year-old kid trying to earn a starting spot on the team, or hoping for a college scholarship recommendation from the coach, and that coach is leading a prayer on the field, you are going to feel an immense coercive pressure to join in, regardless of your own family's faith or lack thereof.
The lemon test recognized that power dynamic and protected the vulnerable student. History and tradition, Sotomayor argued, ignores modern power dynamics and leaves the dissenting student completely unprotected.
With the formal burial of the Lemon Test, the free exercise clause is now the dominant force in the jurisprudence. The doctrinal machinery that kept public money and public institutions strictly separated from religion has been entirely dismantled and replaced.
It's a brand new world.
Okay, we have traced the entire arc. We have seen how the legal standard flicked from no aid to no exclusion. We've seen how Everson's child benefit seed grew into Zelman's true private choice, which then evolved into the absolute non-discrimination mandates of Trinity Lutheran, Espinoza, and Carson. We've explored the financial machinery of universal ESAs and the weaponization of the Blaine Amendment history.
Now we have to look at the total reality of this new landscape.
Yes, we are going to rigorously steelman the strongest arguments for both sides of this funding revolution. And what's crucial to remember here for you listening is that both of these worldviews are interpreting the exact same chain of Supreme Court cases.
Let's start by steelmanning the argument for the new rule. The perspective that sees the last 20 years not as a revolution, but as a glorious, long overdue fulfillment of true religious liberty.
Give it to us at full strength.
From this perspective, the old Lemon regime was inherently hostile to religion. It treated faith as a constitutional toxin that had to be quarantined.
Okay.
The new doctrine corrects that hostility by embracing true neutrality. If a state decides to fund education by giving resources directly to families to choose a private school, excluding religious options isn't neutral, it is active discrimination. It penalizes citizens for their faith.
Right, I see that.
Furthermore, this worldview insists that parents, not the government, are the primary and natural educators of their children. A system that only funds secular public schools coerces families. It forces them to choose between receiving a needed public benefit, a free education, and adhering to their deeply held religious convictions regarding how their children should be raised.
This aligns with Chief Justice Roberts' concept of the play in the joints, the constitutional room between what the Establishment Clause strictly forbids and what the Free Exercise Clause strictly requires.
Exactly. This perspective argues that allowing religious schools to participate equally in neutral, parent-driven programs fits perfectly within that space. It isn't the government establishing a religion. It is the government empowering parents to exercise their fundamental rights. By tearing down the Blaine Amendments, the court didn't erode the Constitution, it purified it. It removed the stain of 19th century anti-Catholic bigotry and finally applied the principle of equal treatment to all faithful citizens.
That is a very powerful articulation of parental liberty. Now let's steelman the exact opposite view, the argument against the new rule, the argument that views this entire 20-year trajectory as a slow-motion constitutional disaster that hollows out the Establishment Clause.
From this perspective, the Supreme Court has played a dangerous game of bait and switch. The mandate of no exclusion has quietly morphed into a mandate to fund religion. And that strikes at the very heart of why the Establishment Clause was written in the first place.
Because taxpayers are footing the bill.
Exactly. If every generally available public benefit like universal ESA funding must now include religious institutions, then taxpayers across the country are being compelled by the state to underwrite religious instruction, theological doctrines, and sectarian practices that they fundamentally disbelieve.
Which is precisely what the founders sought to avoid. I mean, Thomas Jefferson explicitly wrote that forcing a citizen to contribute money to the propagation of opinions they disbelieve is sinful and tyrannical.
Furthermore, this view points to the practical, devastating impact on the public square. Universal ESAs drain massive amounts of capital away from the public school system. Public schools are legally required to accept and serve every single child who walks through their doors,
regardless of severe learning disabilities, behavioral issues, socioeconomic status, or religious background.
Private schools operating on ESA funds, however, maintain exclusive control over their admissions. They can and do selectively admit or decline students. They can legally refuse admission to students based on their sexual orientation, their academic performance, or their religious adherence.
So taxpayer money is being systematically siphoned out of an inclusive, democratic public system and funneled into exclusive private systems that are legally permitted to discriminate.
From this viewpoint, the last 20 years have been the systematic demolition of the Establishment Clause under the guise of choice.
Two completely different realities drawn from the exact same ink. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have seen the wall of separation turned into a turnstile. But the true turning point here isn't a single case. It's a philosophical choice. The entire debate hinges on which clause of the First Amendment you believe should act as the ultimate lodestar of American society.
Do you prioritize the free exercise clause, demanding that the faithful are never penalized or excluded from the public square?
Or do you prioritize the Establishment Clause, demanding that the taxpayer is never forced to fund a church and the state never coerces the dissenting student? For 50 years, the court aggressively chose the latter. Today, it has aggressively chosen the former.
Whether you view this modern era as the fulfillment of liberty or the tragic erosion of pluralist neutrality depends entirely on which constitutional lens you are looking through. Both readings follow logically from the jurisprudence we've outlined today.
Which brings us back to where we started. The needle on the compass has completely flipped. But as we leave you today, I want you to mull over one final, provocative thought. It builds on everything we've discussed, particularly Justice Gorsuch's decision to replace the Lemon test with an appeal to history and tradition.
It's the big question.
If the Supreme Court now relies on history and tradition to decide what violates the Establishment Clause, whose history and whose tradition gets to make the rules?
That is the pivotal, unresolved question of this new era.
We live in a country with centuries of conflicting, messy, competing traditions. We have the tradition of the Protestant common schools of the 1800s. We have the tradition of the strict separationists of the 1970s. We have the tradition of religious dissenters fleeing persecution. We have the tradition of marginalized groups fighting for inclusion.
It's all part of the fabric.
If history and tradition is the new supreme law of the land, who gets to decide which era of history is the legally binding one? When you abandon a functional legal test for a historical narrative, the person who writes the history book holds all the constitutional power.
Something to really think about.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. True understanding doesn't come from picking a team. It comes from seeing the whole board, understanding the legal mechanics at play, and knowing how the arguments are built from the ground up. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep examining your compass, and we'll see you next time.